One big question, of course, still remains. Will Dr. Bernanke develop the same flair for intriguing discourse as his predecessor? We get to decide for ourselves right now. Please join me in giving the Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System a very warm welcome from us, the Economic Club of Chicago.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Miles, for that interesting introduction. It's very nice to be back in this very great city. I always enjoy visiting here. Last time I was here, Mike Moscow gave me both a Cubs hat and a White Sox hat, so I'm ready for any contingency. In my remarks today, I'd like to discuss the relationship between energy markets and the economy. As I'm certain all of you are aware, the steep increases in energy prices over the past several years have had significant consequences for households, businesses, and economic policy. At least since the time of the first oil shock in October 1973, economists have struggled to understand the ways that disturbances to the supply and demand balance in energy markets influence economic growth and inflation. At the most basic level, oil and natural gas are just primary commodities, like tin, rubber, or iron. Yet energy commodities are special, in part because they are critical inputs to a very wide variety of production processes in modern economies. They provide the fuel that drives our transportation systems, heats our homes and offices, and powers our factories. Moreover, energy has an influence that is disproportionate to its share in the real gross domestic product, or GDP, largely because of our limited ability to adjust the amount of energy we use per unit of output over a short period of time. Over longer periods, energy consumption can be altered more easily, for example, by adjusting the types of vehicles that we drive, the kinds of homes that we build, and the variety of machines that we buy. The cumulative loss in oil production attributable to Katrina and Rita amounts to more than 160 million barrels of oil, a figure equivalent to nearly half the present level of commercial crude oil inventories in the United States. With the background of strong demand and limited spare capacity, both actual production disruptions and concerns about the reliability and security of future oil supplies have contributed to the volatility in oil prices. The oil-rich Middle East remains an especially unsettled region of the world, but political risks to the oil supply have also emerged in nations outside the Middle East, including Russia, Venezuela, and Nigeria. Compounding these difficulties in markets for crude oil have been constraints and disruptions in the refining sector of the energy industry. In the wake of Hurricane Rita, 1/4 of domestic refining capacity was offline, and here too, the period of recovery has been protracted. Even before last year's hurricanes, however, a mismatch appeared to be emerging between the incremental supply of crude oil, which tended to be heavy and sulfurous, and the demand by refiners for light, sweet crude, which can be converted more easily into clean-burning transportation fuels. These developments have highlighted the need for additional investments in refining capacity to bridge the gap between upstream supply and final demand. It's a tribute to the underlying strength and resiliency of the U.S. economy that it has been able to perform so well despite the drag from increased energy prices. At the same time that higher oil prices slow economic growth, they also create inflationary pressures. Higher prices for crude oil are passed through to increased prices for the refined products used by consumers, such as gasoline and heating oil. When oil prices rise, people may try to substitute to other forms of energy, such as natural gas, leading to price increases in those alternatives as well. The rise in prices paid by households for energy, for example, for gasoline, heating oil, and natural gas, represent, of course, an increase in the cost of living and thus in inflation. This direct effect of higher energy prices on the cost of living is sometimes called the first-round effect of energy prices on inflation. In addition, higher energy costs may have indirect effects on the inflation rate. If, for example, firms pass on their increased costs of production in the form of higher consumer prices for non-energy goods and services, or if workers respond to increases in the cost of living by demanding higher nominal wages. A jump in energy costs could also increase the public's longer-term inflation expectations, a factor that would also put upward pressure on inflation. These indirect effects of higher energy prices on the overall rate of inflation are called second-round effects. The overall inflation rate reflects both the first-round and the second-round effects of an energy price increase. Economists and other policymakers also pay attention to the so-called core inflation rate, which excludes the direct effects of increases in the price of energy as well as of food. By stripping out the first-round inflation effects, core inflation provides a useful indicator of the second-round effects of an increase in the price of energy. In the past, notably during the 1970s and 1980s, both the first-round and second-round effects of oil price increases on inflation tended to be large. As firms freely passed on rising energy costs to consumers, workers reacted to the surging cost of living by ratcheting up their wage demands, and longer-run expectations of inflation moved up quickly. In that situation, monetary policy making was extremely difficult because oil price increases threatened to result in a large and persistent increase in the overall inflation rate. The Federal Reserve attempted to contain the inflationary effects of the oil price shocks by engineering sharp increases in interest rates, actions which had the consequence of sharply slowing growth and raising unemployment, as in the recessions that began in 1973 and in 1981. Since about 1980, however, the Federal Reserve and most other central banks have worked hard to bring inflation and inflation expectations down. An important benefit of these efforts is that the second-round inflation effect of a given increase in energy prices has been much reduced. To the extent that households and business owners expect that the Fed will keep inflation low, firms have both less incentive and less ability to pass on increased energy costs in the form of higher prices, and likewise workers have less incentive to demand compensating increases in their nominal wages. As I noted in remarks last week, although the rate of pass-through of higher energy and other commodity prices to core consumer price inflation appears to have remained relatively low in the current episode, reflecting the inflation-fighting credibility built by the Fed in recent decades, the cumulative increases in energy and commodity prices have been large enough that they could account for some of the recent pickup in core inflation. In addition, some survey-based measures of longer-term inflation expectations have edged up on net in recent months, as has the compensation for inflation and inflation risk implied by yields on nominal and inflation-indexed government debt. As yet, these expectation measures have remained within the ranges in which they have fluctuated in recent years, and inflation compensation implied by yields on government debt has fallen back somewhat in the past month. Nevertheless, these developments bear watching. In conclusion, energy prices have moved up considerably since the end of 2002, reflecting supply and demand factors. In the short run, prices are likely to remain high in an environment of strong world economic growth and a limited ability to increase energy supplies. Moreover, prices are likely to be volatile in the near term, given the small margins of excess capacity to produce crude oil or natural gas that traditionally have buffered variations in short-run supply and demand. However, in the long run, market forces will respond. The higher relative prices of energy will create incentives for businesses to create new energy-saving technologies and for energy consumers to adopt them. The market for alternative fuels is growing rapidly and will help to shift consumption away from petroleum-based fuels. Government can contribute to these conservation efforts by working to create a regulatory environment that encourages the growth in energy supplies in a manner that is consistent with our nation's environmental and other objectives. Given the extraordinary resilience of the U.S. economy, I'm confident that our nation will be up to this challenge. Thank you very much for your attention.